to have Rabbi Laurie Rice of Congregation Micah as our guest today. Laurie comes to us with vast experience, both professionally as a rabbi, personally as a wife and mother, a woman, a mother, and we are just thrilled that she has found time on a short notice to join us today. As many of you may know, there is a Women's March scheduled both in Washington, D.C. and locally tomorrow in anticipation of the opening of the Supreme Court and all the various cases that may come before this court. So we are thrilled that Rabbi Laurie was available to join us and answer some of our questions in anticipation. So with that, I bring you Rabbi Laurie Rice.
Hi, everybody. So glad to be with you all. All right, thank you for taking the time to learn with us on this Friday. So I'm grateful for Michal's support with our tech today, and I'm going to ask you if you would respond to a few anonymous polls. So we will not know who gives what answer. We're just kind of looking to see where people fall. So we're talking about abortion and Judaism today, reproductive rights and Judaism. And I want to just get a sense of this group with a few anonymous polls. So let's start with the first one, Michal, if you don't mind. So you're going to choose a sentence that you agree with the most. Pick one choice. Again, we will not know which one you particularly picked. We'll just see what the group sort of picks as far as kind of majority percentage of where people are. So go ahead and fill it out. And Michal, I'll leave it to you to determine when everyone's had a chance to do that.
I'll wait another 30 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll now.
Okay. So this one was just about abortion in general. I think abortion should be legal in a woman's choice. I think abortion should be legal in certain but not all circumstances. I think abortion should not be legal and not left to a woman to decide. What did we end up with, Michal, as far as how the poll came out? Wow. Okay. So this just gives us a sense of who's on the call, where people are leaning. But the reason I ask this question is not just to kind of sense who our audience is. And we could have probably predicted, that the audience would have been, I thought we might have had one or two folks in our, kind of third category. But I asked this first because I want us to separate out in our mind. We're going to be looking at what Judaism has to say about the issue of abortion, if anything at all, and from what texts we can glean some sort of authority from the Jewish tradition, and separate that out from kind of our own sense as autonomous Americans, that the ethos of autonomy in America is so strong that sometimes we can confuse what we believe Jewish tradition tells us about a particular topic with, in fact, what we just think should be in accordance with a particular topic. And I want us to be able to kind of separate those two things. So go ahead and close the poll on your screen. Oh, thank you, Michal. Okay, the poll is closed. All right, so now let's go to the second poll, if you would. All right, Judaism supports the legality of abortion and women's right to choose. Judaism supports it in some cases, but not all. Judaism does not permit abortion. Which do you think?
Rabbi, is there a grade for this class?
So far, everyone's got an A, but I do have a pretty tough curve, so hang tight.
Okay, I'm ending the poll.
Okay. Okay, great. So we had about, a nice strong percent. I'm sorry, I had to put myself in the third one just so someone was there. I don't know if anybody else joined me in the last one. but we had about a good showing, not quite half of our group here, that Judaism supports the legality of abortion and a woman's right to choose. And then a little bit more than half of us felt that that was the case in some cases, but not all. Great. All right, we're going to close that poll and use that as a place to begin. We'll come to our third poll a little bit later. We just have one more. So I want to start by just sort of noting that in Judaism, and this isn't going to surprise anyone, that there's a clear bias for life, right? We take l'chaim very seriously. It's not just what we say when we clink glasses. It's really sort of an underlying foundational ethos for the way we understand life, and that life is sacred. And so, although abortion is permitted in some circumstances, and actually, frankly, required in others, and we're going to get to all of this, it's not viewed as morally neutral as a matter of individual desire, or really even an acceptable form of post facto birth control. And this is, again, where I want you to separate out kind of what you might believe as an individual American Jew versus what Jewish tradition offers us in the way of guidance. So contrary to what many, I think, contemporary Jews think, and some of you fell into this category, Jewish law restricts the legitimacy of abortion to really a narrow range of cases. It does not give blanket permission to abort. So we're just going to start there, kind of take that in. And now let's look at what some of that is about. So unlike Catholicism, for example, Judaism does not see all abortion as murder. I think that's an important place to start, because biblical and rabbinic sources understand the process of gestation developmentally. So the Torah stipulates that, for example, if a woman miscarries due to an assault, that the assailant is not held liable for murder, but rather must only pay for the lost capital value of the fetus. So that early law already indicates that the fetus is not to be viewed as a full-fledged human being, but rather as part of one. So let me restate in different words what I just said, which is, if a pregnant woman loses her fetus, her developing child, due to an assault, the assailant is not held on the charge of murder. And as a result, we glean that the rabbis understand that developing fetus to not be a full life that is capable of being murdered. Okay, from there, the Talmud determines that within the first 40 days after conception, the fetus, the zygote, if you will, is simply water. Another Talmudic source distinguishes the first trimester from the remainder of gestation. And these marking points are not based on a theory of when a soul develops at a particular moment in the uterus. They're determined by the physical development of the fetus. So that time, the idea of determining when a life is viable based on when a soul develops, that is called ensoulment, which is a really, I think, interesting term. And that is not how Judaism determines when fetus is viable. It's purely based on physical development. And that's something that's really unique to Judaism in a faith context. Now, the effect of these delineations or demarcations, if you would, is to make abortion during the early period permitted for more reasons than during the rest of pregnancy, when the fetus is legally categorized. And this is the term that the Jewish tradition uses, like the thigh of its mother. So up until a certain period of time, as the fetus is developing, it's considered a part of the mother and not all on its own viable entity. And during that time, it's not considered, there are more opportunities or more legitimate reasons, according to Jewish tradition, for an abortion to be permissible. because our bodies are considered God's property, neither men nor women are permitted to amputate their thigh to preserve their life or their health. And so by and large, abortion is forbidden. That's where that comes from, this idea that it's just like a mother's thigh. So let me pause for a moment. Think about the prohibitions in Judaism around tattooing or certain piercings. For up until kind of recent times, there was a lot of skepticism and sort of prohibition around organ donation and even cremation, because it's this idea that the body doesn't belong to us, that it belongs to God, and it's on loan to us to house our souls, which belong completely to us. So this sort of fundamental belief in Jewish bioethics that the body belongs to God plays a role in the subject of can we or can we not abort. I'm just going to pause for a moment because I've already shared a lot of information to say, are there any questions before I go on? Okay. I'm going to keep going.
Sorry, just a quick, because we have such a fantastic large audience, if you do have a question, please put it in the chat.
Okay, great. Then let me just stop me.
I'll keep an eye on that. Yeah. So anyone who has a question, place it in the chat and I'll keep track of them.
Okay, that would be excellent. All right. So I'm going to assume that's happening. Okay. So for example, if couples want to engage in family planning, Jewish law prefers that they use forms of birth control that prevent conception in the first place, rather than those that abort an already fertilized egg, meaning that if you can avoid abortion, do so. It should not be considered a form of birth control with equity without all other forms. If you can engage in family planning to begin with, that would be preferable. And abortion, again, for Judaism, is not meant to be a post facto form of birth control. It doesn't mean that there aren't circumstances in which it's still permissible, but blanketly, that's not something that Judaism would agree. Jews are often unaware, I think, of the fact that in most cases, Judaism forbids abortion because we've heard correctly that Jewish law requires abortion in some cases and in fact permits it in others. And so that fact leads us to mistakenly think that abortion is permitted at will, when in fact, a fact of Jewish law generally forbids it. Now, Jewish law requires abortion when the woman's life or health, physical or mental, is threatened by the pregnancy. Jewish law permits abortion when the risk to a woman's life or health, again, physical or mental, and we'll talk about that because there's some complications with that, is greater than that of a normal pregnancy, but not so great as to constitute a clear and present danger to her. Let me say that again. Jewish law requires abortion when the woman's life is threatened. It permits abortion when the risk to the woman's life or health is greater than a normal pregnancy, but not so great as to constitute a clear and present danger to her. So that is our gray area that is unique to Judaism, because we're going to ask all sorts of questions there about, well, who gets to decide? Is it up to the mother, the woman, to decide my health is at risk, and so it's permissible? Who determines that? We're going to come back to that. The fetus in Judaism does not attain the full rights and protections of a human being until birth. Specifically, when the forehead emerges, or if it's a breech birth, forehead doesn't come out first, when most of the body emerges. The mother has full human status at all times. So consequently, if the fetus threatens the life or health of the mother, then it may, and in some cases must, be aborted. Let's go to, Michal, let's skip the first text I gave you from Exodus, but let's go to the Mishnah. If a woman has life-threatening, can you put that up on the screen for us?
Yes, it's the same file, right?
It's the same file. It just kind of scrolls down. Yeah, so skip the Exodus text for a moment and let's go to, maybe I didn't give you this text. Let me just see. Can you keep scrolling? Okay, go back up for a moment. Go back up. You're doing great. Sorry, scroll back. Let's go to this, keep going back. Yeah, let's stop here. So first of all, I just want to show you where some of these texts come from. This is from Talmud Yevamot. Rav Chisda said, she immerses and partakes of truma, the Thanksgiving offering, only until 40 days after her husband's death, when there's still no reason for concern, as if she is not pregnant, then she is not pregnant. And if she is pregnant, now, by the way, this Talmudic text has nothing to do with abortion, because that was not a concern enough to have a full tractate. This is actually about offerings and when they can be consumed. But it deals with what happens if someone's pregnant, can they consume an offering? If she's pregnant until 40 days from conception, the fetus is merely water. It is not yet considered a living being, and therefore does not disqualify its mother from partaking of the truma offering. So in this text, just by way of addressing a totally different subject, we get this really important and directive statement that until 40 days from conception, the fetus is merely water, like not even anything substantial to consider. All right, let's keep going, Michal, to the next text. From Mishnah Nida. In a case where a woman gives birth to twins, if they are tumtum and a male, or a hermaphrodite and a male, by the way, this is not the part I want us to focus on, she observes the strictures of a woman who gave birth to both male and to a female. Skip down to the bolded part. If the fetus emerged in pieces, or if it emerged reverse, right? Breech, feet first rather than head first, when most of its limbs emerge, its status is like that of a child born. With regard to the impurity of a woman after childbirth, if the fetus emerged in the usual manner, head first, it is not considered born until most of its head emerges. And what is considered most of its head? It is from when its forehead emerges. So from this text, we also get some direction as to when is it considered a life on equal footing with the life of the mother. So, remember, with so many scientific and medical advances that we've been blessed to benefit from since the biblical and Talmudic times, our sacred texts are not going to address these issues head on. We have to glean from other things that they say with regards to other issues, how they might address this particular topic. Okay, and then let's go finally to the next Mishnah, which was the one I was looking at originally. If a woman is having trouble giving birth or has life-threatening difficulty in childbirth, one dismembers the embryo in her womb limb by limb because her life takes precedence over its life. Once its head or its greater part has come out, one may not touch it, for we do not set aside one life for another. I have to tell you, friends, I probably have seen this Mishnah before in reading this literature, but because of the current dialogue in the political arena around abortion and reproductive rights, and I would just say, ridiculous conspiracy theory that those who seek abortion are looking to chop up a baby in its mother's womb. Remember when we all heard that and our jaws dropped, like, that's not a thing. But I read this text from the Mishnah and I was like, oh, okay, nobody show this text. Let's just hide it. Kind of crazy, right? If a woman is having trouble, one dismembers the embryo in her womb. We're just gonna, Michal, you can take this down from our screen. We're just gonna hide this text from Mishnah Olot and hope that nobody else ever sees it. Okay, so I just had to share that because I was like, oh, I guess that comes right from Jewish tradition. Okay, but here's what's important about that text. With this Mishnah as a basis, all Jewish sources, hold on, let me go to screens. All Jewish sources would require abortion in order to preserve the life or organs of the mother. But authorities differ widely concerning how much of a threat to a woman's health the fetus must pose to justify or require an abortion, right? And this is where it gets pretty interesting for us, I think, as thinking, rational, linear individuals. Now, let's look at this one case. When a woman is impregnated with 3 or more fetuses, so think about like IVF. So, and this could be, by the way, it doesn't have to be through IVF, right? A woman could be impregnated with 3 or more fetuses naturally. It happens. People have triplets, twins, quadruplets. So it can be artificially or naturally. An abortion of 1 or more of them may be indicated in order to preserve both the life of the mother and the viability and health of the remaining fetuses. So in this case, in order to protect the life of the mother and the viability of the majority or the remainder of the fetuses, it may be required or important to abort one. These abortions, this kind of abortion is permitted, even required, depending on the circumstances. Although, in the case of IVF, and this is an aside, it's best not to implant more than 3 fetuses in the first place, so as to prevent the necessity of aborting those beyond the number a woman can safely carry. And I don't know, I'm not a high risk OB, but I don't know if 3 is the number after which it does become, for medical reasons, even more of a dicey situation. But 3 is the number that Judaism uses as sort of the line of safety. When it becomes possible to determine through genetic testing which of the fetuses have a greater chance to survive and be healthy, then it will be permissible selectively to abort those less likely to survive. But this is the same criterion that's to be used for triage decisions made at the end of life, right? This is not just applied to abortion and fetuses. If all the fetuses are equally viable, the abortions must be done on a random basis. Okay, that was just an example kind of how the Jewish thinking works on this subject. In other words, sometimes it's permissible, even required, but there's still thought that goes into acknowledging viability of life, protecting life that already exists, meaning the life of the mother, over those that are not. Okay, so there is a responsa, which is what I would say kind of a more modern legal ruling made by a rabbi named Israel Mizrahi. And this was from the late 17th century. And many modern authorities have kind of looked to Rabbi Mizrahi's ruling that permits abortion to preserve a mother's mental health. And this ruling has been variously construed both narrowly and leniently in modern times. Let me just look to see. I don't think I gave you that text, Michal. Don't do anything yet. Let me see if it's here. No, not yet. Okay. So to the extent that Jewish law makes special provision for an unusually young or old mother, an unmarried mother, or the victim of a rape, or the participant in an adulterous or incestuous union, abortion is permitted to preserve the mother's mental health. Let me repeat that. What constitutes a mother's mental health? Well, it could be if she's unusually young and thus really not equipped to become a mother, unusually old for childbearing age, and thus maybe for other reasons not equipped at that stage of life to be a mother and raise a child successfully, or that her body health-wise cannot carry a child healthily to term. Interesting that the responsa includes an unmarried mother, because I think there are many of us who would say there are plenty of very successful single mothers out there. I don't think anyone would argue with the notion of someone who's a victim of rape, or the participant in an adulterous or incestuous union. So for all of these reasons, abortion is permitted to preserve a mother's mental health. Now, mental health has not been interpreted nearly as broadly in Jewish sources as it has been in American courts, right? The permission would not include, for example, the right to abort simply because a woman doesn't want to have another child. Because we might argue that that is a very fair consideration for mental health. Like, I'm already working 3 jobs. I have 5 children. I don't want to have another. there's no sort of category for that in Judaism as being a strain to mental health, but it has been argued, it is an argument in sort of the American landscape. Now, there's also no justification in the traditional sources for aborting a fetus for reasons having to do with the health of the fetus. Only the mother's health is a consideration. And so as a result, some people object to performing an amniocentesis at all, even when the intent is to determine whether to abort a malformed fetus. And I thought this just kind of hit me sadly as kind of an aspect of Jewish tradition. Others reason in precisely the opposite direction. They justify abortion of a defective fetus on the basis of preserving the mother's mental health, where it's clear that the mother is not able to cope with the prospect of bearing or raising such a child. And I have shared before, and I'll talk about it a little bit further on, but it's not just about, will I have a child with special needs? It's, will I have a child who will have any kind of life at all? And I had a particular situation with my first pregnancy where we found about 21 weeks into gestation that we were carrying a child that is called a triploid. If you think about Down syndrome is triple of one, so there's 2 of every chromosome, right? There's 26X and 26Y. But for Down syndrome, I think you have 3 of chromosome 23. Well, a triploid is 3 of every chromosome. And unlike the great idea that would just make you have a bionic baby, it in fact is a triploid child, if they live to term, which is rare, they almost never reach the age of 1 before dying. And so in our case, we then had this conversation about having an abortion. I'll come back to that story in a little bit. But Judaism doesn't leave room for that kind of conversation around a mother's mental health. The viability of the fetus in this case, the health of the fetus is not taken into consideration. And I think that's important to note. Now, that may also have been because there were no methods by which one could sort of assess the health of a fetus at the time that Judaism was commenting and determining sort of law and praxis around this issue. So, the beauty of the development, and I would say reformation ongoing, I like to say all Judaism is Reform Judaism, if you will, because the reason why it continues to this day is because it adapts with the social historical norms of the moment. And so that's why we have modern rulings that we call responsa that speak to, well, now that we can determine the health of a life based on what we know of the fetus in the mother's womb, certain things may in fact become permissible that once were not.
Rabbi Laurie, that leads to, there's a question in the chat that sort of ties to this about, so in modern times, in liberal Jewish traditions, who does help to make these determinations?
Okay, great. So if we can hold that question for a moment, because I have a poll that's going to come to it, and we're just maybe 10 minutes away from it. We're going to talk about that. It's a great question, and I promise I'm going to come back to it. So hang on to it for a moment. Okay. Now, many conservative and Reform rabbis, and even I would say a few contemporary Orthodox rabbis, have handled the matter in a completely different way. They reason that traditional sources recognize only threats to the mother's health as grounds for abortion, because, as I mentioned, until recently, it was really impossible to know anything about the genetic or medical makeup of the fetus before birth. But we have all sorts of, thank God, new medical knowledge that ought to establish the fetus's health as an independent consideration. Okay, so there are problems with this last approach as well, even though it seems like probably all of us would on the outset just agree that the fetus's health should be an independent consideration. But here's where that becomes problematic. Aside from the fact that it would represent an innovation in the law, which that's okay. There are innovations in law in Judaism all the time. It raises the extremely difficult issue of determining what constitutes, and this comes to the question that was just asked, what constitutes a sufficient defect to warrant abortion? Who decides, right? Who decides when the mother's health is mental health is taxed? Who decides what constitutes a sufficient defect? Now, the easy cases, and none of them are emotionally easy, as we know, but the easy cases are those in which the fetus has minimal brain tissue, like an encephaly, or a degenerative disease like Tay-Sachs that leads to the baby's death within a few years of birth at most. You could say triploid falls into that category, what we experienced, or Huntington's chorea, though where the degeneration will not usually begin in, well, let me back up. Okay, so you have certain cases, Tay-Sachs, triploid, encephalitis, where there's an obvious threat and sufficient defect. But then you have these other cases, and that's where I marked down on my notes, Huntington's chorea, where degeneration doesn't usually begin until age 35 or 40. So not all would agree that abortion is justified in that case, because some would argue that a person will live an extended period of time without suffering from any of the disease's debilitating effects, enough time to have children of his or her own and even participate in much of their rearing. And since there's reasonable hope that a cure could be developed in that time, would something like Huntington's be a sufficient defect to warrant abortion? And then where do we draw the line, right? 25 years, 15 years, 10 years? What constitutes a defect justifying abortion in the first place? Is it a mental mental disability? If so, how much? Blindness? Deafness? We quickly slide into the danger of defining qualifications for a master race. And I say that on purpose because we sort of cringe at that notion, right? Based on what we've been through as a people. And we don't want to have this corollary depreciation of disabled people. That's not what we're about as Jews. So in our particular case, when we found out we were having a triploid child, I instantly knew, based on the outcomes of what I understood the outcomes to be, and we had terrific genetic counseling, that I wanted to have an abortion, not carry the child to term if it was able to go to term, and then wait for it to no longer live sometime in that first year. Rabbi Flip did not. He all of a sudden was struck with this: I've created a life, and even though it's not the life I wanted to create, I don't feel like I have the authority to decide when that life ends. And, we share very similar values, Flip and I, but there are certain scenarios that are presented to you as a married couple that you cannot anticipate how you will respond before it happens. And I would say not just as a married couple. There are all sorts of scenarios that we face as individuals that until we're in that moment, we don't know how we'll respond. We don't know how we will feel emotionally. And that can be really, really difficult. Now, I will tell you, in our case, we were scheduled to have I think it was an early third term abortion. Ultimately, Flip said, you're carrying, this is your body, and it's ultimately your choice, which is probably why we're still married. No, I'm just kidding. But we actually scheduled to have an abortion, and the night before, we didn't know this, but the fetus had already died on its own, and I went into natural delivery and delivered that. I don't even know what it was. It wasn't living fetus, no longer living fetus. So I never had the abortion, but I would have had it. And I was grateful at the time that I had the option to make that choice. And I'll just say, I think it's really important that we have those opportunities to make those choices, but that's an aside. So the difficulty of making these decisions does not mean that we can or should shrink from them, because I think human life requires decisions all throughout, right? We make them all the time. And unlike Christian Science, Judaism has taken the stand that we don't have to accept whatever nature serves us. We have the right, and I would even say we have the duty to intervene medically as partners or agents of God. And, the advances of modern medical science have created this whole new spectrum of decisions that we may prefer not to make. But there's no escaping our duty to confront these issues as responsibly as we can. Let's pause for a moment, Michal. Let's do our third poll. Okay, so please choose the sentence that you agree with the most. When you're thinking about what to answer, if you haven't already, it doesn't have to just do with reproductive rights. First of all, if you're a guy on this Zoom, you could think about anything. You could think about if Jewish tradition informed whether or not you took the COVID vaccine, or whether or not you would want to, if you and a partner or you on your own were having a baby, would you want to have an amniocentesis? If you were determining whether or not to end life support for a loved one, would it be important to you that you consult your rabbi in the Jewish tradition in advance of making such a decision? So this applies to lots of different health and medical issues.
Okay, I'm ending the poll.
Thanks, Michal. Let's see what we got here. Okay, great. You guys are so good. All right, so let's talk about this for just a moment before we go back to our specific topic on reproductive rights. I find this fascinating because one of my most favorite and admired teachers from my time as a seminary student is a conservative rabbi by the name of Rabbi Elliot Dorff. And he's really one of the premier bioethicists in the Jewish tradition. Rabbi Kulik and I brought him for a session on vaccine ethics during our 2020 year. Anyway, he presents kind of a scenario of how to think about the role that Jewish law and authority plays in our decision-making by denominational delineation. Here's what he says. Now, obviously, these are sweeping general terms. So you can go ahead and close the poll, Michal, if you don't mind. Thanks. So what he says is, let's take the case that I suggested about life support. God forbid someone you care for and love dearly is on life support, and you are charged with the decision to keep that person living or not. And how do you make that decision? And Rabbi Dorff suggests that if you are, that we have sort of like two ways that we might go about that. We might consult Jewish tradition and how much of a role does that play in our decision-making? And then we have sort of our autonomous individual selves that makes those decisions based on just kind of what we feel is right, what matters to us, but not informed by our faith tradition. And what Rabbi Dorff says is that if you're like truly a practicing Orthodox Jew, theologically, that the tradition will get 2 votes and the autonomous decision choice within you gets 1. And that if you're a conservative Jew, it's not so much the letter of the law, but what is the communal norm? Because conservative Judaism is so much about how does the community practice and how do I stay in line with the community? And for Reform Judaism, it's sort of the opposite of Orthodoxy in that the autonomous individual gets 2 votes and that the tradition would get 1. And so it's really interesting to ask this question because I often think, well, I mean, I'm a rabbi, you would sort of think I might be the anomaly as a Reform rabbi, that I would still sort of be in that first category, Judaism being so important to me. But the truth is, I don't think we can ever really truly know what the percentage is of what we factor in. I can tell you that when it comes to the issue of reproductive rights and abortion, Judaism could say it is fully permissible or it is never permissible, and I will still advocate for the right for a woman to choose in every situation. That's just what my American autonomous ethos as a woman tells me is right. So I really appreciate the learning that I'm sharing with you today, and I love knowing it as a basis for being able to have this conversation. But ultimately, it doesn't sway. It's great intellectual fodder for me, but it doesn't sway my opinion on that matter. Now, when it came to the COVID vaccine, I will tell you that there are other vaccines that have, in all honesty, I'll tell you, no one in our family has ever received the flu shot. We've just never received the flu shot. We never got it. We've never gotten the flu, thank God, but we've never taken the flu shot. And even though I knew I was going to get the vaccine, the moment I was able to sign up, I got kind of nervous. Like, okay, I'm going to get it, but is it okay that I'm getting it? And I want to tell you ultimately, the notion that the health of the community in this case was more important than my own individual fear around, well, what if in 15 years we learn that this mRNA technology was not good for us and I grow like a fourth ear, 2 more ears or something. For me, that I was like a conservative Jew in that moment. This is what the community needs, and that's what I need to do. That's my role. So, I had you fill that poll out, but I don't think it's always the same answer in every situation. But I think it's really valuable to be aware of how we're making our decisions, even if we don't make them the same way every time, if that makes sense. So let's go back, because I want to make sure, Beth, that I fully get to your question about who decides, because that's going to be the conversation we're all going to have in just a moment. I want to come back to, actually, Michal, will you share again the text sheet? I want to share this piece from Rabbi Jacobovitz, which I think is so interesting. So yeah, keep that there for a moment. We're going to come there in a minute. So in the area of abortion, we will undoubtedly find that whereas in some cases abortion is clearly justifiable or unjustifiable, in others the matter is more clouded. In the latter group, the traditional method of judging the issue on the basis of the mother's mental reaction to the defect may be the wisest. And for some mothers, raising a child with mental disabilities is totally manageable, but for others, it's really beyond their psychological competence. I may have had you share too early, but you can just keep it up. It's fine. I'm going to come to it in a moment. This, of course, means that the only people who are psychologically strongest and most stable would have the responsibility for raising such children, and that's also totally unfair. Moreover, if most families abort, and I use this term like in major quotes, defective, and I'm really speaking about the fetus, not the child, because I would never describe a child as defective, one wonders about the degree to which society in the long run will tolerate imperfections and provide for people who have them, right? I mean, the very sensitivity of society to the sanctity of life is really at stake with this question. We have to develop guidelines for making these decisions, at least in the relatively clear cases. And I think it's also incumbent upon us to educate medical and religious professionals to help families face the very difficult, even I would say excruciating decisions where no guidelines are possible. And this is really the tough issue around abortion for the sake of the mental health of the mother, as well as determining the viability of a fetus. Who decides? And I don't have clear answers for that. And I think, different people will give different responses. And there's a lot in the area of ethics to consider. So while I really appreciate that Judaism gives a lot of latitude and room, and I've always loved that one of the things about our tradition is that there's a lot that's in the gray. And when they don't know, they don't say they know. But that doesn't always make it easier for us. Sometimes fundamentalism, it's so clear cut, just makes it a whole lot easier to stay in your lane. So we have to work a little bit harder as Jews. But that's okay. That's why we use our brains, our seichel. Now, in practice, much of this discussion is actually fairly moot. Jews in North America and in Israel engage in abortion almost indiscriminately, to the extent that by 1975, and here we have our quote, Rabbi Jacobovitz says, abortions deprived the Jewish state of over 1 million native-born citizens since its foundation, not to mention the even greater losses through the violation of law on contraception. All this at a time when Israel is lavishing vastly superior resources relatively on boosting her precarious population figures by inducing but a small fraction of this number among Western Jews to go on aliyah, with all the huge problems of finance and social adjustment involved in their absorption. So I think we can see where Rabbi Jacobovitz stands here. He does not feel that abortion should be a consideration at all when ultimately we need to be increasing our population numbers as a Jewish people. Plain and simple. That's the most important thing. And so, you know, because coming back to one of the first things I said, that there is kind of a misunderstanding in the Jewish community that abortion, for the most part, in almost all cases, is permissible. American Jews and Israeli Jews tend to practice abortion without going through the painstaking consideration of these multiple issues at hand. The high rate of abortion among Jews is, well, some would say a problematic phenomenon for the contemporary Jewish community, because we know that Jews statistically are barely reproducing themselves in Israel, and they're falling far short of that in North America. And so because of those statistics, the conservative rabbinate, and this is the next text, if you want to show it, Michal, and it's Rabbinic Letter on Intimate Relations notes, it says the contemporary demographic problem of the Jewish people must also be a factor which figures into the thinking of Jews using contraception. Abortion may not be used as a post-facto form of birth control. Couples should seriously consider having 3 or 4 children. And I'll tell you another story. Same Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who I just adore. I had one child, our first one, Shai, and I was at a conference in Phoenix on Judaism and health, the intersection of Judaism and health. And Rabbi Dorff was one of the keynotes. And I was so excited to introduce him to my son. And I think I was pregnant with Asher, our second, at the time. And he said, "Oh, it's delightful to meet your son. And I'm excited, you know, Basha'a Tova, in all good time, with your second." And he said, "But you're going to have a third, right?" And, you know, you don't really say that to a mother who's pregnant with her second. And I said, and I'm pretty sure at the time the answer was no, but I didn't want to say that and disappoint my mentor. So I said, well, we're just working on this one right now, or something like that. And he said, "You have the third for the Jewish people." Like, looked me straight in the eye, not even joking. And I'm going to tell you something. We had our third for the Jewish people. So, and sometimes I wonder if I should have had a fourth, but that's a whole nother conversation we're not going to discuss on the Zoom. Okay. So, you know, conservative Judaism really feels strongly and made a statement about the population of the Jewish people needing to grow, and the concern they have with the role of abortion in you know, sort of an obstacle to that population growth. So rabbis who are relatively liberal in their interpretation of Jewish law on contraception and abortion may be found simultaneously calling for Jews to have children so that the Jewish people in Judaism can continue for more than another generation or two. All right, I've offered a lot of information. I would like to sort of put a pause on it for now and open it. Thank you, Michal. We can stop share on the text and open it to questions and conversation. So Deborah, if there are questions in the chat, I haven't opened it, but that you want to throw out, please do.
Yeah, there's a lot of really excellent questions in the chat here. So some of them you've already sort of gotten to, but one is is there a dispute within the entire Jewish community about the point at which a fetus becomes a separate life?
So that's a great question. I mean, the texts are clear or not clear. The texts offer us a bit of a guideline with regards to the emergence of either the whole of the majority of a breech body or the forehead of a baby who's delivering naturally and not breech, as the time in which it becomes a full life. on even ground with the life of the mother. But at the same time, there's nothing within Jewish text that speaks to, unless it is a clear, unless the mother's life is in clear jeopardy, her physical health, that speaks to kind of what we would call late term abortion. So this is one of those places where the text, because abortion wasn't, sort of a medical reality for our biblical text or our Talmudic text, it's one of those things where the texts don't speak specifically to that issue. And I think authors of responsa literature are hesitant to make a blanket judgment because there are so many variables that each case is unique and different. And that's where, for Orthodoxy, the ruling of an individual rabbi for a community or for a conservative community, sort of the communal norm of what's accepted. And again, remember that is tinted here in the United States by what our sort of American ethos is around the subject of abortion. So in this particular group, where in our first poll, most people said, I believe that abortion should be legal and that it is a woman's right to choose, that is going to color how it is we think these decisions should be made.
So that sort of relates to the next question of how does Judaism define a, quote, harder than usual pregnancy to allow abortion?
And so it doesn't. That's the thing. I mean, back to, I think it was Beth's question about who decides. And ultimately, that's what's really tough. There are so many factors here to consider. I mean, Rabbi Dorff is saying we should consider the population growth or shrinkage of the Jewish community in making these decisions. And again, I shared my personal experience because in that moment, there was no Jewish text that was going to weigh more heavily than my heart in that moment. I knew I wanted to be a mom and I wanted to get into the business of having a healthy baby as soon as I could. And the only way to do that was to move forward from this experience and start again. So yeah, it's not clear.
And actually, it was in the chat, but I also wanted to just personally thank you for sharing the personal story. I know we all appreciate you sharing both professionally and personally. There's a question about the father's feelings. Is that something that's taken into consideration in these discussions, Jewishly?
I think that was Jan. I'm so glad you asked that. I mean, again, I would say this is where, in Judaism, what's so great is that the biblical texts are interpreted and the Talmudic texts are part of a conversation. They don't stand alone in a vacuum. It's why we do our learning in Havruta, in conversation with one another, because Judaism is a living faith tradition and it only exists as it is practiced between people. I like to say there's no such thing as a Jewish hermit, right? It's really hard to live out our Judaism alone. Almost everything we do in Judaism is done in some sort of community, every celebration, every grieving opportunity to grieve or mourn. And so I would say that while there are no texts, to my knowledge, Jan, that speak specifically to the father's feelings, it could not be a lived, real, practical experience without acknowledging that this doesn't just happen, as was in my case, to the woman who's carrying the child. That would just be impractical. So the text give us a certain layer, and then the real lived experiences of the Jewish community in grappling with these issues and interpreting the text so as to make their best choices and live their best, healthiest communal lives comes to bear.
Okay, hold on. Let me get back to, there was one here. about the breath. Sorry, let me find it again. Okay, so in the beginning, in the beginning of the Bereshit, references to the beginning of life referring to breath. God breathed the breath of life into the being. Are there not other references to the end of life being associated with the release of last breath or spirit? It would, in that view, follow that life in Jewish tradition begins with the first breath. Might we understand the earlier text cited by the rabbi as, associated with the release of breath?
Okay, so first of all, I love this.
Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
No, that's great. And if you were to do any research or read any of the medical ethics books around reproductive rights and abortion in Judaism, those particular, the text about that God breathes the breath of life into us from Genesis, and then there's that beautiful midrash on when Moses dies, where the way that Moses dies, ultimately, after a huge runaround of Moses really not wanting to die, which we don't get in the Torah at all, but the rabbis imagine must have occurred. Ultimately, God takes Moses with a kiss, with that breath, which is a beautiful image. You know, the idea that we come into life with God breathing our souls into us, and that we leave life with that like release of the soul. That is a spiritual rendering of how I would say less about how our life begins and more about how our soul moves from body to body. Now, this is not a class on, you know, eschatology or the afterlife, or, you know, my personal query around multiple lives. And, you know, this is the body that my soul is currently living in, and I'm curious to see what body it lives in next. Hopefully one with a little bit more melanin in the skin, so I don't have to go to my skin doctor so often. So no, the answer is those texts are not referenced with regards to the viability of a fetus in Jewish medical ethics. I think it's because those texts speak more to sort of the spirituality component of the ensoulment of a body and not the medical reality of life. And Judaism seems to separate those two out, whereas other, you know, like some Christian traditions, that the viability of life is about the fetus having a soul and being a living being, and Judaism seems to separate those two. Leslie said, please come on the interval between the emergency baby's head and the first breath the child draws. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what you want me to comment on, Leslie, except I don't know what's going on in that period of time, but we know that there is that moment, right? When the baby comes out before the whole suction thing happens, and then you hear the scream. And I don't know. It's very interesting. I mean, but also not surprising that the rabbis would sort of grab onto that moment. And also, you know, the idea of sort of ensoulment and that God would breathe our soul into us and then like take it out with a kiss also anthropomorphizes God, which not all of us might subscribe to. You know, that's how we understand God to be. So that's a very interesting question. I love that you asked it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, great question. There's another one. Have any Jewish ethicists revised the quote, the fetus gets full rights at birth, end quote, given medical advances to move viability to late second trimester or early third trimester?
I'm going to guess the answer is yes to that. I don't have anything at my fingertips right now to share with you. But you can, I'm pretty sure, research just by Googling even Jewish responsa reproductive rights or Jewish responsa abortion, and you will probably find responsa literature from the various movements within Judaism on this particular topic. And so you'll probably find from more conservative voices responsa that do move that viability earlier, thus making abortion trickier prior to birth.
I'm going to take host prerogative and ask my own question, just because I'm curious. So, when my husband and I were first married, we were married within the conservative movement, and when we had our pre-marriage counseling with the rabbi insisted that we do taste-sex testing before the marriage. And I'm just wondering, in general, like genetic testing, that kind of thing, is that how Jewish law? Where's Jewish law in that, and does it vary by strains? And then if you have to, I have another personal story, but I won't share that. But just in general, Jewish law and that sort of genetic testing.
My understanding, Deborah, too, is that in probably outside of the ultra-Orthodox community, that is very highly practiced and a communal norm. It's not invasive. It's prior to conception. It's considered family planning. And remember, going back to this idea of that family planning is far preferred to getting to a place where one has to decide about a post-gestational termination of life. So my understanding, again, is outside of the ultra-Orthodox community, where family planning is something that, is practiced in the way that we think of secular family planning, that's very common and supported. I know it was what went through the same conversation when we were getting married as well. So, yeah. Okay.
And this is more of a comment about parents who have children with, or a woman who has experience working with children with severe handicaps. Also, there was an earlier question related to end of life, other end of life questions of, sorry, let me try to get back to that. The quality, deciding the quality of life. So not only in this decision, but also in other, how we factor in quality of life.
Right. And I think that's where, look, we can't have a fetus fill out, an end of life ethical will or, end of life directives. It's why they're so important for us to do for our loved ones, so that they have them and know what we would want. Should we, God forbid, find ourselves in a position to have those decisions made on our behalf. Because I would imagine, and I've not had to make these decisions for a loved one, that would be exceptionally challenging. And especially if family members don't agree and there's no directives. So, those, as much to the extent that we can make those wishes clear, it just makes it easier for everyone, medical staff included. And again, Judaism is very much about planning and, even I would say, to the extent that cremation is not something that is celebrated by Jewish tradition or Jewish law, there are many Jews who choose that for themselves upon death. And there are many rabbis who say that we would advise, this is not what the Jewish community embraces or celebrates, but it's a wholly personal choice and one that each person gets to make. But that's another perfect example of how do we make our decisions as Jews? How many votes does the tradition get, and how many votes does sort of our autonomous voice get? And depending on what the subject matter is, it may differ, right? It's kind of amazing, the things where we say, well, Judaism, of course I wouldn't do that. Judaism would say that I can't do that. And other things where we would say, well, I don't really care what Judaism has to say about that. Of course I'm going to make that choice. So, and I guess that's the beauty of being, being Jewish, is that it's the challenge and the blessing all at the same time. It's not clear, and we have to use our mind and think a whole lot. And again, sometimes it would be a lot easier if there was just a playbook, but I don't think it'd be as fun, and we wouldn't be as colorful as a people.
Well, I think that we are at time, but that also feels like a perfect closing thought for this. So again, our huge appreciation to you for joining us today, for sharing all of this wisdom, both the professional and the personal. It was really an extraordinary hour. And I can tell that by the number of people who are still on the hall, we may need to revisit some of this. There's a lot of questions that did go unanswered, and so we may have to revisit and ask you back to ask and continue the conversation. For those interested, I just want to mention, some of you may be aware, there is a Women's March in Washington tomorrow. There is a local version here in Nashville, a march in, as we were saying, it's not necessarily Jewish tradition, but our United States autonomous position for women's reproductive freedoms. And anyone who would like to join a group of us that is walking tomorrow, please feel free to email me, Deborah@jewishnashville.org, and I will tell you what we've got going locally. But the event itself will start at the state capitol at 4. They are marching to the federal building, and then there will be a program for anybody who wants to participate in that tomorrow afternoon. So again, thank you so much, Rabbi Laurie, for joining us. Thank you all for participating.
And thank you, Michal. So grateful. Thanks, everyone. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.